Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Olivia was lying comfortably in bed after a long day. Her eyes slowly began to close and her tired body was about to fall into a deep sleep. However, there was something unsettling in the house. At first, she didn't notice. She thought it was just the wind whistling through the old windows or the distant noises from the neighboring houses. She assumed she'd have another quiet night's sleep. Suddenly, she became aware of it. A child's cry, but it wasn't just any cry. This cry was filled with deep pain, fear, and abandonment. The sound was broken and agonizing. Olivia's heart raced. She opened her eyes and for a few moments blinked impatiently in the dark room, trying to understand the source of the sound. It was past midnight and everything was very quiet. Outside, only the sound of the wind could be heard. But the crying was growing louder. Olivia sat up in bed and got out. She hadn't turned on the light. The pale glow from the street lamps outside was the only illumination in the room. But something urged her to follow the sound. It was so strong that it almost physically called her. She moved towards it. She approached the window and began to look outside. The abandoned school stood in the middle of a large area surrounded by trees. The moon, peeking out from behind the clouds, briefly revealed the school's terrifying silhouette. Though it was only a few hundred meters away, the dark, abandoned state of the school had always unnerved Olivia. She knew the old building hadn't been used in a long time, but tonight, something felt different. The crying continued. It seemed to be coming from the forest behind the school, but the darkness made everything seem more terrifying and unknown. Olivia cautiously opened the window and listened more carefully. After a short time, she realized the sound was clearer. It was the cry of a child, but something was missing. It was filled with sadness, fear, and perhaps a sense of abandonment. Within minutes, Olivia's desire to remain in the dark alone turned into a curiosity she could no longer resist. The sound felt strangely familiar. She could feel it, but couldn't remember exactly where from. Regardless, she decided to go to the school. The strange feeling growing inside her wavered between unease and curiosity. Her feet almost unknowingly began to take her down the path to the school. Her heart raced and she struggled to control her emotions. She only wanted to follow the sounds, but deep down, she knew that every step she took was leading her towards something final. She took so many steps that her feet seemed to sink into the ground, as if with each step she was falling further. When she found the school's metal gate, she paused for a moment. The old, rusted iron gate seemed to defy time, unused for so many years. Olivia took a deep breath in the darkness and gently pushed the gate. It creaked open. The air inside the abandoned school smelled of dust and dampness. As she stepped inside, pale light filtered through the broken windows. At that moment, Olivia felt strangely alone, but also as if she had to do something, touch something. In every room there were traces of the past. Old dusty desks and chairs, cracked walls. Nothing was in its place. The many darkened corners of the school gave the impression that something had been lost by those who had once lived here before leaving. Everything felt like a loss, but what exactly was it? Olivia paused for a moment. She felt lost too. She moved down one of the crooked hallways. She heard the sound again. It was no longer just the cry of a child. There was fear in the sound. Deep fear. Something was telling her to find the source of this sound. As if a secret in the school, something waiting for so long was waiting to be revealed to her. At the end of the hallway, she saw the classroom door. Her skin tingled, but as the crying sound grew louder, she continued to take steps forward. She slowly opened the door to the classroom and entered. Her eyes searched for something in the dark. Everything was silent, but she noticed something. In the far corner of the room there was an old desk and on it a photograph. The face of the child in the photo belonged to Elliot, one of the former students here. Elliot. Olivia's mind briefly flashed with that name. It felt so familiar, so close. The day Elliot went missing, the townspeople had been silent for a long time, and no one wanted to talk about the emptiness he left behind. She realized the crying was still present, but her hands trembling as she held the photo. As she tried to remember something about the school's past, suddenly the door slammed shut. Olivia was thrown back in fear. There was only one sound left: Elliot's agonizing screams, echoing as if from somewhere, as though they had always been there. When the door suddenly slammed shut, Olivia was thrown back in terror. In the depths of the dark classroom, there was only the sound of a whistling cold wind and the fear within it. Her breath was quick and uneven. A cold sweat had gripped her. Hands and her body felt enveloped in panic. For a moment she paused, trying to think, but there was only one thing: the cry that echoed in her mind, reverberating over everything, inside everything. Her eyes drifted to the corners of the classroom, which grew darker with each passing second. Broken desks, rotting sections of the ceiling, cracked chalkboards. Everything was filled with the traces of a long-abandoned school. But the sound. Olivia was too frightened and alone to cope with it. She had never felt anything like this before. With every step, she felt something was getting closer. A presence. Perhaps the lost spirit of a child who had disappeared in this school was following her. "Olivia," she whispered to herself slowly. "Just leave and go, there's nothing here." But still, she had to take one more step. Curiosity overpowered her fear. At that moment, an inner urge slowly forced her to move forward. She gently pushed the door of the classroom open as quietly as possible. Almost leaning against the wall, she stepped into the corridor. With each step on the floor, a silence deepened, as if time had stopped in this abandoned school. The hallway was dark. There was no light source except for the moonlight. On the wall were old, yellowed paintings and shadows of willow tree branches. Olivia tried to open her eyes wider to see them. There were so many memories here: photos of former students, colorful drawings that reminded her of joyful times in the classrooms. But now, this old school had turned into an abandoned graveyard. Olivia could feel how lonely everything was. After walking down the corridor for a while, the crying sound reached her ears again. It was very close now. But this time it wasn't just the cry of a child. There seemed to be another sound, another person, another presence. This sound came not from fear, but from a desire to scream, from a wish to be helped. The pain of Elliot's lost soul had somehow started to reach Olivia. Olivia's steps began to quicken. For a moment, she realized that everything was spiraling out of control. It was as if the presence inside the school was getting closer to her, leaking from the walls, the floors. With each step, she seemed to disappear a little more, sinking deeper into the darkness. Her fear deepened, but turning back seemed even more terrifying with each passing second. "What are you doing?" she said to herself, but she noticed her voice trembling. "This place is abandoned. Just go, turn back." But it was as if her feet were disobeying her mind, pulling her in another direction. She realized she couldn't stop. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision. Something was hidden in this school. There was a secret, and the cries and lost souls were pointing to it. Olivia had a feeling in her heart that the fear in this school had been accumulating for years, and it was finally trying to reach her. As she moved down the corridor, rooms and classrooms followed one after another. Many doors were locked with old locks, but one door appeared to be open. A faint light seeped from the edge of the door. Olivia gently pushed the door and stepped inside. The room was eerily calm, but there was something vague and dark, as if something was watching Olivia. The dust covering everything in the room showed that it hadn't been used for years. But this dust didn't seem to hide the fact that everything was old and abandoned. Then Olivia heard a sound. Olivia. The voice sounded like the cry she had heard before, but it also carried a whisper. Olivia turned her head in fear. At that moment, on the edge of the old desk behind her, Elliot's photograph caught her eye again. The same photograph. The same child. But there were more photos on the desk, buried in the dust. Olivia carefully bent down and found another one. It was another photo of Elliot, This time, the child's face was darkened as if something had been on the photo, a faint smudge like a fingerprint. She noticed the writing beneath the photo. "Elliot, you're not here." Olivia froze in fear. Had this message been written by one of the old students of the school? Were these the last words of a child who had gone missing here, never to return? As she tried to gather her thoughts, the voice grew louder once again. "Don't cry. Help me. Find me," she heard a voice shouting. Slowly turning her eyes behind her, a shadow was emerging from the dark corner of the room. At that moment, she tried to overcome her fear, but her body was frozen. The shadow was slowly moving toward her. With each step, her heart raced faster. The silhouette of the shadow began to sharpen, but it looked less like a human form and more like an undefined entity. Olivia stood still. She wanted to get out of there, but with every step, the presence was getting closer. Suddenly, a light appeared in the darkness. It came from another part of the school. Olivia decided to move toward that light, but with every step, the shadow continued to follow her. There was no turning back now. There was only one path: to reach that light. Slowly, but determinedly, she walked toward the light. Behind her, the whispered words of a lost spirit still echoed in her ears. "Help me, please." As Olivia ventured deeper into the school, the fear of the shadow behind her grew stronger. The shadow seemed to be following her throughout the entire corridor, listening to her footsteps, watching her every move. This presence felt like a terrifying omen, and with each passing second, Olivia realized she was vanishing into the darkness. But that light, the light from the other room, seemed like a glimmer of hope. She had to reach it. Olivia quickened her pace, but the shadow quickened as well. With each step, the presence seemed to come closer, as if at any moment something would touch her, pull her inside. Trying to suppress the growing depth of her fear, she decided to focus solely on the light. That light, perhaps, was a way out. Perhaps only in that light, where deep fear and lost souls intertwined, could she find meaning. When she turned the corner of the corridor, she finally saw the light. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint pale light streamed through. However, the darkness beyond that light made everything inside the room appear more terrifying and threatening. Olivia slowly pushed the door open. As she stepped inside, she took a deep breath. It felt as if she were walking along the riverbank, but this river was filled with the dark waters of fear. She didn't know where she was going, but this step was a search for a spirit lost in the darkness. The room, like the others, was abandoned. But there was a difference. Everything looked much more broken, more destroyed. Torn papers on the old walls, faded photographs, a cracked desk, and broken chairs. But in one corner of the room, almost like a memento, there was an old chair. On the chair, there was an object left by someone. Her eyes drifted toward it. As she approached to see what the object was, she slowly took a step forward. Olivia noticed an old box placed on the chair. The box was covered in dust, its corners marked by the passage of time. As she opened the lid, she curiously tried to discover what was inside. At that moment, she found something in the box, a doll. But this doll was different. Unlike other toys, its eyes seemed almost alive. Its face was faded, but for a moment, its eyes seemed to shift toward Olivia's. It gave her an eerie feeling. The doll, though it appeared to be just a toy, made Olivia feel something else, a connection, a call. The doll seemed to be looking at her. As Olivia picked it up, she heard a voice, this time much closer and sharper. "Don't forget me," she heard a whisper. The voice was so close and clear that Olivia felt as if it were coming from behind her, but she didn't dare turn around. In that moment, everything felt like a dream, and she felt alone in the room. The doll, once again, seemed to keep its gaze fixed on her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. The light that had entered the room was abruptly extinguished, and everything went dark. Olivia stepped back in fear. At that moment, voices began to whisper from the walls in every corner of the room. Quickly, sounds started rising from all around the room. It was as if the school had decided to reveal a secret it had kept hidden for years. Something was falling from the walls, and things were moving in every corner. Olivia's heart started to race. There was something here, something waiting for her. For a moment, as her vision blurred, she saw shapes appear inside the room. Behind the shapes, a child's ghost appeared. Elliot. The child's darkened, blurry image became clearer with each passing second. Elliot's face was expressionless, terrified, and helpless. His eyes, trembling with fear, were looking at Olivia. But at the same time, there was a call for help. This child had been so lost that it seemed like he had been waiting for someone to hear his call for years. Olivia gathered her courage and took a step toward Elliot. "Elliot, I will help you," she said, but it seemed as if the child couldn't hear her. The child started moving, almost as if he were trying to approach her. Olivia could feel the fear coursing through every part of her, but there was something, a force, that was pulling her toward this child. Elliot's fear, pain, and loneliness were drawing closer to Olivia. For a moment she noticed Elliot extending his hands toward her. Reaching out, he came closer to her. Olivia, in a grim manner, bent down toward him, and in that instant, she noticed something. Elliot's hands were hesitant, cold, and stiff. At that moment, Olivia realized that the child could not touch her. This was just a ghost, a lost soul, and this soul would not find an escape without help. At that moment, everything around the room began to topple. The ground shook, and terrifying sounds rose from the walls. The room seemed to be collapsing, falling apart. Olivia leaned toward Elliot, who was collapsed on the floor, but something stopped her. His eyes, now more terrified and full of pain, were looking at her. "Don't leave me here," he whispered. "I don't want to be alone." Olivia recoiled in horror. Elliot's eyes were telling her something. The soul of a lost child was trapped in endless pain, and Olivia realized that she couldn't leave without helping him. But this would not be easy. Olivia was now facing Elliot's terrified eyes. The child's helpless gaze seemed to be trying to tell her something. Her heart was pounding, and with every passing second, she felt herself slipping into the darkness. She noticed that everything beneath her feet was decaying, that the ghostly soul embedded in the walls of this school was still chained here. But Elliot's call helped her understand what had brought her here. She had to help him. But how? Elliot's hands weren't asking for a touch, they were trying to make a connection. But when Olivia felt this, her fear grew exponentially. Elliot's presence was not just a ghost. It was the soul of a being trapped from another time, another era. The child was a part of the school's walls, its rooms, every corner. At that moment, something clicked in Olivia's mind. This school wasn't just an abandoned building. This school was the home of a soul that had disappeared years ago. Elliot's soul. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. "Elliot," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to help you. But first, you must tell me what happened to you." The child stared into the darkness behind him, remaining silent for a while. Olivia could still see the fear and pain in his eyes. His eyes seemed almost frozen, but there was a faint glimmer of hope shining through. Elliot slowly nodded his head, sighed deeply, and began to speak quietly. I got lost here. Here. And no one found me," he said, his voice trembling as if coming from far away. There was so much noise in the school. Everyone was having fun. But when I got lost, no one noticed. No one found me. As Olivia processed what Elliot said, she imagined a time long ago in the school, perhaps years ago, when a child had been left alone. As Elliot's voice echoed in her mind, she suddenly realized something. The soul of the child who had gone missing was trapped here, and everything around her, the abandoned walls, floors, and rooms, was holding the echoes of his soul. This was a curse, and the fears of the past had gathered here. "Elliot, they left. You alone?" Olivia said softly. "But I will help you. You need to get out. I must help you leave." Elliot fell silent for a moment. He slowly nodded, but it was clear his fear still ran deep. Olivia continued, believing there must be a solution to everything. "I can't get out of here," Elliot said, his eyes now more terrified. "I'm trapped in this room. Don't leave me. You have to get me out of here." Suddenly, Olivia noticed movement in the corner of the room. She turned her head and saw something slowly moving from one of the dark corners. It was as if a being was sliding through the darkness, slowly advancing toward them. Its eyes were dark and hollow, glowing eerily. Olivia stepped back in terror. Elliot's spirit struggled to give her more information about this presence. "Olivia, that thing," Elliot said, his eyes filling with tears. "It's the thing that's keeping me here. I encountered it and now I'm a lost soul. It chained me here." Shivering with fear, Olivia watched the dark being's every move. This entity was something beyond a ghost, beyond a spirit. Its eyes shone almost like a void, merging with the surrounding darkness. Olivia, in desperation, stepped back and closed her eyes for a moment. She knew she had to do something else. This dark entity was trapped within the soul of a lost spirit, but it was also something else, a figure of fear. It was a monster. In an instant, the dark entity rapidly approached Olivia. Just as she was about to scream in fear, her eyes shifted to Elliot. He was now more frightened than ever, but he began to speak, trying to offer help. "This school, the curse. The souls of everyone who went missing here are trapped inside this school," Elliot said in a trembling voice. "The thing that keeps me here draws all the lost souls to this school. They're all scared of each other, but they can't escape. That thing feeds on all of us." Olivia, in a panic, turned her eyes back to the dark entity. In that moment, she tried to grasp the meaning of everything Elliot had said. This school had become a trap. All the souls trapped here fed on each other's fear, and the entity grew stronger every day. Everything in this school, every room, every corridor, every stone was wrapped in this curse. As Elliot's soul remained trapped here as a lost child, the other lost souls were also trapped in the same way. Olivia, in her desperation, made an inner decision. She had to free Elliot from this place. But for that, there was only one thing to do: face the dark entity. Elliot's eyes were now filled with hope as he looked at Olivia. Olivia approached him with the feeling of wanting to embrace the child. She had to find a way. She had to find a way to leave this school. But first, she had to face that entity and free the lost souls. "I will help you, Elliot," Olivia said firmly. "We will leave this place together. We will escape this school." In that moment, everything seemed to suddenly change. The dark entity quickly closed the distance between them, while Olivia and Elliot decided to take one final step to wake up from this nightmare. Olivia, with the hope she received from Elliot's eyes, watched the approaching steps of the dark entity. The entity was neither human nor a complete ghost. The shadow approaching quickly made the air around it denser with every step, pulling the warmth of the room into a cold depth. Olivia had decided to face the dark entity. But how? How could she find a solution? The fate of all the souls trapped in this school depended on her next move. Elliot, holding Olivia tightly, began to feel her fear. The fear that appeared in his eyes was not just hers, but a shared emotion of all the lost souls here. A lost child had become trapped here in painful waiting. Olivia, though feeling the cold touch of fear, had to fight against this trap that surrounded the souls. There was no other way. Looking deeply into Olivia's eyes, Elliot said, "That entity, that dark entity, it's the thing that trapped us here." His voice trembled. "If it doesn't let us go, we'll stay here. All of us. We're all connected. That entity is drawing us in, feeding on our fear. You have to learn not to fear, Olivia. Only you can do this." Olivia took a deep breath and continued to watch the dark entity. Elliot's words made sense. The entity, like the other souls in the school, used fear as its source. Each of them was afraid, and that fear fed the entity. Olivia had to cut off this fear, destroy it, but she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to do it. As the dark entity slowly approached them, time seemed to freeze. Its eyes shone in the void, almost piercing Olivia's soul. The fear that the entity carried tried to take control of Olivia. The fear was felt so sharply, as though something was watching her from every corner. But suddenly, for a brief moment, Olivia stood against the fear within her. Elliot's courage gave her strength. If she truly wanted to save the lost souls in this school, she had to face her fear. If she did that, maybe she could stop this dark entity. "I'm not afraid," Olivia said with determination in her voice. "You can't scare me." In that moment, the dark entity suddenly lunged toward her. Olivia quickly stepped back, moving behind Elliot to protect him. The entity rapidly closed the distance between them, as if it were going to wrap itself around her. As the darkness engulfed everything, each corner became more mysterious and frightening. But Olivia felt that something within her had changed. She had accepted her fear, and that gave her strength. Elliot's gaze was now more determined. As he watched Olivia, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. That hope symbolized the search for a way out of here for all the lost souls. Olivia had to make one final move to save them. "Olivia!" Elliot shouted. "That entity feeds on our fear. You must destroy it. You must destroy the fear." Olivia, taking a deep breath, turned her eyes back to the dark entity. In that moment, listening to the sound of her heart, she realized that everything had a solution. The dark entity was like a reflection, the embodiment of fear. If she was going to defeat it, the entity had to be destroyed. But how? Olivia quickly stepped back, and determination became clear in her eyes. As the dark entity rapidly approached her, Olivia decided to fully open her soul. She had to confront her fear by releasing it. Only by accepting her fear could she destroy it. "I'm not afraid," Olivia shouted, her voice echoing in the darkness. "I accept my fear and I release it." In that moment, everything changed. The dark entity, shaken by the power it drew from Olivia's courage, staggered. In its eyes, a lost sorrow and a trace of fear appeared. It was as if the entire entity began to break apart with Olivia's inner strength. Fear had finally broken its own chains. The dark, shadowy entity let out a scream and began to rapidly retreat. But Olivia didn't stop. She followed it. As the dark entity took steps back, all the darkness in the school began to slowly melt away. Fear gradually diminished. The walls, the ceilings, everything. The entire cursed school was being disrupted by Olivia's inner power. As the dark entity lost its fear, it staggered and eventually disappeared. The fear surrounding the school slowly began to dissipate. Elliot looked at Olivia with hope in his eyes. "I told you," he said. "Conquering fear would free this school and us. You did it." Olivia took a deep breath. The darkness inside the school was slowly beginning to lighten. The souls were being freed from this fear-filled darkness. Elliot, with peace in his eyes, slowly faded away. But Olivia would never forget him, because the soul of a lost child in this school had taught her the deepest lesson. Fear is just a reflection, and resisting it is one's greatest strength. In the darkness, only a light of hope remained, and Olivia had found it. The last trace of fear in the school's corridors was finally vanishing. Olivia, taking a deep breath, listened to the silence around her. The dark entity slowly dissolved, breaking the chains of fear and freeing the entire school from its curse. In that moment, all the walls, the floors, and everything else seemed to feel like they had been freed from the trapped souls. Things returned to normal quickly, but Olivia had managed to bear such a heavy burden. The school groaned one final time, filled with deep sorrow. As Olivia looked around, she realized how quiet the school had become. Where darkness had once covered every corner, now everything was bathed in light. The evil souls that had once hidden in the darkness were now free. Elliot's presence had finally disappeared, but the sense of loyalty to him and the other lost souls would never leave Olivia. The school's outer gate somehow opened by itself. The large old iron gate moved slowly, signaling Olivia's freedom. In that moment, she realized that all the weight inside her had lifted, and she felt a deep sense of relief in her soul. Many lost souls had been freed, but the freedom of one, Elliot, had affected her the most. Olivia sighed deeply and stepped outside through the gate. There was a peace in her eyes. Yet, in her heart, a constant ache remained. After all, in this school, it wasn't only the soul of a child that had been lost, but also the traces of the past. The walls of the school, sadly, had harbored, too, much pain. She walked silently for a while. Behind her, the silhouette of the abandoned school remained with its old walls and window panes. Outside, the cold midnight wind gently brushed her face. Olivia was left alone with a kind of emptiness that came with freedom. The fear and worries inside her had been wiped away, but another feeling, perhaps peace, had taken its place. In that moment, something appeared in her mind. Elliot's smiling face. The child was peaceful after his salvation, but Olivia was also aware of something. Elliot's soul had found freedom, but every piece of the past would remain in Olivia's memory. Every moment of that terrifying school, every lost soul, might eventually be forgotten, but it would never be erased from Olivia's heart. For a moment she wanted to turn back and look at the school again, but then she noticed something moving toward the dark walls of the school. Olivia narrowed her eyes in curiosity and began to look more carefully. For a brief moment, fear seemed to resurface. However, what came to her mind was the fact that the souls of others had finally found peace. Darkness could always return, but Olivia had learned not to fear it. The school's doors had closed. Whatever had happened, everything had come to an end. That fear-filled night had left deep marks on Olivia's heart, but she was stronger now. The lost souls in that school had finally found peace. Olivia quickened her steps, with joy in her eyes but also sadness as she walked away. Slowly, she gazed one last time at the abandoned walls of the school, took a deep breath, and continued her way. The traces of the past and the fears, though erased, would always be remembered. Each moment had meant some sort of redemption. Olivia continued her journey, leaving behind the memories and the freed hearts of the lost souls. And after a while, far from that terrifying school, at the side of a road in a town, Olivia's steps slowed. This was now a peaceful and calm place. The dark shadows of the past no longer lingered here. Olivia took another deep breath and stepped into the peaceful night. The school, like a lost memory, was now far behind. And the only thing that had truly disappeared was the fear that reminded her of that moment. Now Olivia, after the freedom of a ghost, a child, a once lost soul, moved forward to wake up to another day.